This series is dedicated to Brother Steve Coakley.
Demand a list of potential black informants and troublemakers. That's Boule action. That's Boule action. It then says that Robert Church of Memphis, Tennessee, who's the first black millionaire in America. Remember, the first black millionaire in America was a spy.
Try to cut my remarks down, but after all, I'm a Negro Baptist preacher, you know. Nobody can control a Negro Baptist preacher, even God sometimes can.
Wilkins, he's on his last legs. And Phil Randolph, who was a great man, he's very ill. And there was no one left except their old Martin Luther. And Martin came down to confess his sins to Big Daddy.
As the saying goes, never expect something from someone tomorrow they could have done yesterday. So what exactly do so-called black people expect to be given to them from the children of their ancestors' supposed oppressors? Is there any black power that can be given from the hand of whites? How many currently living white people today are actually responsible for the oppression of blacks, regardless if they have reaped benefits from that circumstance? The real question should be asked: do Negroes in America truly have the power to build for themselves independently without any interference from whites? Who or what stands in the way of black self-determination? These are just some of the questions that plague the conscious black philosophical thought. At the forefront of this philosophical discussion is the unavoidable question of slavery, which seems to mold the essence of the so-called black experience. A philosophy of past oppression based in colorism has been drilled into the psyche of the world and accepted as a foregone truth. The term black experience has been used as a catch-all phrase, perpetuating the amalgamation of individual experiences from different people, from different areas at different times into a single homogeneous background, reducing the experiences of an entire people into a Mark Twain novel or a Spielberg plantation epic. But we all know this is far from the truth. The so-called Black American experience is a well-manufactured curriculum that has been packaged and sold to the world by the hidden hand of the powers that be. A purposeful perversion, a corrupt concoction, a calculated Carter G. The miseducation of the Negro, if you will, is at the top of their agenda. And as history recalls, many of the greatest Black leaders in American history were puppeteered by that secret master of that agenda. Indubitably at the center of this issue is race and the role it plays in the social strata of American history. Our ideas about the American past are black and white and less accurate than Angel Reese from 3 feet. Much of that black and white past is centered around the African slave trade. But has this narrative been embellished to the point of supreme fallacy? Now imagine for a second that the entire narrative was indeed a fabrication. Wouldn't that be something else?
It said right on the wall, don't feed the teachers. And then the subline is feed the dumb and the ambitious. Now, Julius Rosenwald became a trustee of the Rockefeller Foundation in 22 after distributing more than $4 million or less out of his pocket to build schools for Southern blacks.
Quote from the New York Times. Roots plagiarism suit is settled. Alex Haley just settled a lawsuit yesterday by acknowledging that his world-renowned book, Roots, contains some material from a relatively unknown novel about slavery that was published 9 years earlier. The settlement ended a 6-week trial of a suit by Harold Courtlander, a 70-year-old author from Bethesda, Maryland, who contended that there were substantial similarities between Roots and his own earlier novel, The African. He sued in federal district court in Manhattan for more than half the profits of Roots. As the trial was about to reach a climax, with summations by opposing lawyers, they issued the following statement. The suit has been amicably settled out of court. Alex Haley acknowledges and regrets that vacious materials, and it does say vacious, even though it's supposed to say various. Alex Haley acknowledges, and this is the New York Times, and if this is supposed to be an accurate representation of what the paper was, don't edit vacious out. Yes, there was a misspelling in the New York Times, just in case you think all this shit's typed. Alex Haley acknowledges and regrets that various materials from The African by Harold Courtlander found their way into his book, Roots. I regret that I stole your shit. Under the agreement to settle, the amount of money that will be paid to Mr. Courtlander and his publisher, Crown, was not disclosed, but the nature of the case made it seem that the amount would be hundreds of thousands of dollars. You know, Alex Haley is the person who wrote the autobiography of Malcolm X. This is Black history, African slave propaganda of the highest order. Pun intended. Mr. Freemason Alex Haley. Yes, Mr. Haley is a Freemason, but I'm not pointing to a larger conspiracy. I'm not saying the Freemasons forced him to write a stolen archive. I would like to think that the Masons write their own shit and don't steal. But anyway, well, all right. That was a stupid statement. Never mind. The defendants in the suit were Mr. Haley and his publishers Doubleday and Dare. The American Broadcasting Company, ABC, which televised Roots, was dropped as a defendant by mutual agreement earlier in the trial. Oh, was dropped. Hey, man, listen, you can go after the publishers, but don't go after ABC, all right? Well, right, that is a hair too far. Roots rapidly became enormously successful after it was published in 1976. It won a Pulitzer Prize. A Pulitzer Prize for plagiarism. Wow. Sold millions of copies and produced a series of television programs that exerted a powerful impact throughout the country. In contrast, The African only sold 14,000 copies in hardcover and 130,000 in paperback during the several years after its publication in 1967. Woo! You know, that nigga was hot. He's like, this nigga Alex Haley done stole my store, got the shit on TV, made all this money. And I only sold, 14,000 copies is, I feel like that's strong. And 130,000 paperback. So there are people who had already read the story. And I wonder, like, when the people who had read The African watched Roots, they were like, man, okay, I know this story. It's based off, it's called The African. They must have just renamed it Roots. Yeah, I know the guy who wrote this, Alex Haley. Nah, it was another guy, some Corlander guy. No, this is a Haley, bro. This is black. This is black excellence right here, my nigga. What you mean, Corlander? Is Corlander a white guy? I don't know. He probably is a white guy. Judge Robert J. Ward, who conducted the trial without a jury, proposed a settlement a few weeks ago after Mr. Corlander's lawyer, Robert N. Kaplan, presented the case for the plaintiffs. But all ABC has to say is this is a fictional story that was once plagiarized by Alex Haley. This is a fictional, they can put it right at the beginning of the movie. Roots, a fictionalized story plagiarized by Alex Haley. And they just keep it moving. After the negotiations on the proposal broke down, the defense lawyers moved for a mistrial, arguing that the judge had proposed a settlement for an amount they had rejected. The amount was not disclosed, but the defense lawyers said it raised a question about whether the judge could continue the trial with impartiality. Judge Ward, stressing his impartiality, ruled that the trial would continue. He had made it clear at the opening of the trial that the key issue would be whether there is substantial similarity between Roots and the earlier The African. So they were trying to get the judge kicked out of here because they didn't like his proposal. They were like, we rejected his proposal. We just think that he'll hold that over us and it won't be a fair trial. A similar case was dismissed last September by another judge, Marvin E. Frankel, who ruled there were only insignificant similarities between Roots and a 1966 novel called Jubilee that had been written by Margaret Walker Alexander, a professor at Jackson State College in Mississippi. Wow. This is somebody else. Professor at Jackson State. He plagiarized a black woman and a white man. She didn't win her case, though. There were only insignificant similarities because the most significant were the white man. That's crazy. He has been given a creative CDL license to write whatever the fuck he wants. The book by Dr. Alexander, who is one of the country's most respected black writers, was based on what she described as the true story of her great-grandmother. She said her book depicted black life in Georgia before, during, and after the Civil War. Her suit, which was filed in Manhattan in April 1977, alleged that parts of Roots had been largely copied from her book. At the same time, Mr. Corlander reported that Roots contained some striking similarities to his books, and he filed his suit the next month. Mr. Corlander is a novelist who has written 27 books, many of them drawing heavily on folklore. He is not black. His book, The African, is a novel that explores the transitions of Africans from tribal freedom to plantation slavery. It's all propaganda here. Possibly the only true story is Dr. Alexander's story. Shortly before both copyright infringement suits were filed, the Sunday Times of London reported that its investigation by Mark Ottaway had raised many questions about the factual basis of the African portion of Mr. Haley's account of his ancestors' journey from what is now Gambia to slavery in America. Oh, well, we got a ton of questions about that. We could go look at the database and let's see what ship he was on. Yeah, this is how they got from Gambia to America. Yeah, it's a true story. Now we're digging into it. We know it's bullshit. Now when you hear these slave narrative, these slave ship narratives, we know they've all been put up to a task, or they put themselves up to a task. I'm gonna write a slave story. And this is what happened on the boat. And this is what happened when they arrived at port. And this is where they went. The slave narrative has so many angles that the fictional possibilities are infinite. Just ask Mr. Haley. Mr. Haley had conceded that parts of Roots were fictionalized, but he denied that he had knowingly made any factual errors. He defended his book about his ancestors as a symbolic history of a people. Oh, whoa, we gotta backtrack. He got a moonwalk on that shit, right? Hold on. This is a symbolic history of a people, all right? This isn't about my people per se. It's about a people in general. In the case of the African, Mr. Berger argued for the defense that Roots was the result of a colossal research effort by Mr. Haley. He added that there was no substantial similarity between the two books within the meaning of the copyright law. Mr. Haley, testifying in his own defense, vehemently denied that he had taken any of the plot or characters in Roots from the African. He said that his book was based on the story of my own maternal family through 7 generations from Africa to America. Oh, you mean the story that he obviously lied about? No. This is my history, okay? Although it is fictionalized, it's also true. According to Mr. Haley, who was 57 years old, or who was then 57 years old, and lives in Los Angeles, he had never even heard of the African until after Roots had been published. But he conceded, here we go, he conceded that 3 brief passages in his book had apparently come from an earlier book. The passages are identified by Mr. Haley as references to Kunta, I guess maybe Kunta Kinte's, Kunta's grandfather on page 225 of Roots. Kunta awakening more lighthearted on page 321, and a camp meeting on page 369. He explained that someone must have given the passages to him without attributing them to the African. Hold on. Someone gave you the passages that you put in your book, and they didn't attribute them to the African? So did you attribute the passages to the person who gave you the passages? Let's get to the root. Let's get to the root of the culprit. Many people gave him handwritten notes and other material while he was doing his extensive research. On the boat from Gambia to America, tracing the course. Mr. Haley said, many people gave him handwritten notes and other material while he was doing his extensive research, Mr. Haley said. And student volunteers went through some of the material to find anything that might be useful to him. Student volunteers. Somewhere, he added, somebody gave me something that came from the African. That's the best, honest explanation I can give. That sounds totally honest. Somewhere, somebody gave me something that was stolen, and ended up in my book that I apparently wrote about my family. The 3 passages mentioned by Mr. Haley were cited by Mr. Kaplan, the lawyer for the plaintiffs, who also referred to a number of other passages that had allegedly been copied. An example cited by Mr. Kaplan concerned a field call used by plantation slaves in the African. He said the key words are, well, yoo-hoo, aho, don't you hear me calling you? A similar incident occurred in the Roots manuscript. He continued, and it says, from the road not long after the field hands heard a rising, lingering sing-song, yoo-hoo, aho, spelled the same way, don't you hear me calling you? End quote from the New York Times. Roots' plagiarism suit is settled. I wonder if there are any other slave narratives that are supposedly based upon true stories that have turned out to be complete lies. There's one thing when you call it fiction. It's another thing when you call it history.
What's your name?
Kunta.
Real talk. The institution of slavery was not a reality for all so-called black folks, especially going up into the War of 1812. Between 1790 and 1860, the slave population statistics skyrocketed by 5 times the original number. But we've been taught to believe that this was some Hollywood blockbuster from shore to shackles, the 2-week conquest of Africa and America, when in reality, the South had only entirely been conquered for about 50 years before emancipation, meaning people who had deep South roots, who ended up in slavery, had not experienced slavery for 300 years. The total colonization may have taken that long, but most of the first slaves in mainland America came from territories in America around the oldest port cities along the eastern seaboard, from places like Tidewater, Virginia, coastal areas in the Carolinas like Georgetown and Charleston, and other areas like New Orleans, as I have previously mentioned. For example, the Tuscarora, the Yamasee, the Temuca, and the Appalachee were sold out of Port Charleston in the early 1700s as slaves. Remember that the influx of slaves onto the American census wasn't until after the end of the transatlantic slave trade in 1808. That number was a result of the wars with the Indians. And despite all this, there was still a significant portion of Negroes, aka Indigenous Americans, aka free colored people who had never been enslaved. Most of those people never made the history books, but a special few did.
Unbeknownst to myself, was being flushed out by competing powers around the mayor who just happened to have been the head of the Boulè. I didn't know it then. I didn't have the damn grid to fit over what I was seeing.
Throughout this series, we have discussed both the Boulè and Prince Hall Freemasons and the differences between the two. Although there are connections between the organizations, they are not exclusively tied to one another. Yes, Prince Hall Freemasons can be members of Boulè, and yes, members of Boulè can be members of Prince Hall, but their origins, contributions, and affiliations are individually unique to each group. The origins of Prince Hall Freemasons extend much further back in history than do the origins of Boulè. The first Prince Hall lodges opened in the late 1700s, whereas the Boulè was not established as an organization until the early 1900s. With all this being said, there were other organizations that more resemble the characteristics of the Boulè that are much older than the Boulè, such as the Brown Fellowship Society of Charleston and the Free African Society of Philadelphia. There is a subtle racial undertone of inequality between these two groups. Prince Hall Freemasonry was exclusively for Black men. However, the stipulations upon race qualified any Black person with a small percentage of Negro blood to be included as a member. This was the first distinction between Prince Hall Freemasons and regular accepted Masons of the Grand Lodge. Prince Hall Freemasonry was somewhat exclusively for Black men, though the membership criteria allowed individuals with very small percentages of Black ancestry to join. This marked a significant difference between Prince Hall Masons and regular Masons of the Grand Lodge, particularly in America, where Black men were generally excluded from these Masonic fraternities. However, many individuals with less visible Black ancestry were granted membership in white Freemasonry. Notably, the founders of the Boulè, known as Sigma Pi Phi, often passed for white, having attended predominantly white institutions that barred Black students at the time, ultimately earning doctoral degrees in medicine. Most Prince Hall Freemasons could not pass for white, although some of the less melanated have reached the higher ranks of the organization. Being a light-skinned member of Prince Hall Freemasonry, or a member who could easily pass for white, doesn't imply that they are passing for Black. They are assumed Black. However, the same could not be assumed about a Negro who joins white Freemasonry. Often, Prince Hall Freemasons gained prominence through their involvement in the church. The church provided a platform for men to establish their reputations within their communities. At this time, the most influential men in so-called Black communities were pastors, and in most cases, those pastors were Prince Hall Freemasons. Back during the 20s and 30s, Harlem was widely regarded as the intellectual mecca of the progressive Negro and the cultural hotbed for Blacks in the early 20th century. Home to some of the most notable names in so-called Black American history. During this time, literature was at the peak of its powers of propaganda. It was during these days that the literature would lay the foundation for future movements that were unofficially born out of this era. I contend that the cultural climate of Harlem significantly influenced the Black Power movement of the 50s and 60s.
The Black people here in Harlem are more intellectually independent than Black people anywhere in America. Black people in Harlem can think for themselves, and Black people in Harlem think Black. Black people in New York, they think Black, they walk Black, they talk Black, they're proud to be Black. And therefore, when a white political machine tries to tell Black people in New York who to accept as the leader, Black people in Harlem don't go for that.
When you say that you're talking about the Negro in New York.
Well, the so-called Negro in New York probably is more sophisticated and enlightened with the UN here and all these television channels, and he hears what's going on all over the world. He's more enlightened
He's not living in those dark ages where you can get people to turn the other cheek no matter how much they're being brutalized.
You're saying he's different than Negroes elsewhere.
He's more well-informed. The New York Negro is better informed on world affairs and national affairs than any Negro in this country.
His attitudes reflect other Negroes throughout the country?
Well, his attitude catches, it spreads. He sets the attitudes of for other Negroes throughout the country.
Earlier in this series, we discussed the platforms of W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey and their competing philosophies. Du Bois more the supporter of the Boulè-esque philosophy of the talented 10th, the philosophy that the top 10% of Negroes should be elevated above the rest into the dominant society and inserted as leaders. The other 90% should follow. Now, what was Du Bois' criteria for determining who is the top 10%? Possibly the indoctrinated information champions of the standard education system, perhaps? The one funded by Rockefeller? The same Rockefeller that funded the Dunbar apartment complex? The co-op in which W.E.B. Du Bois just happened to live? Perhaps. If a person could retain and regurgitate all of the useless information they learned in school from standard education, would that qualify a person to be a member of this illustrious,
talented 10th?
It should also not be overlooked that Du Bois was a communist and received financial support from communists, who were, at the time, the only majority leftist white political group who were apparently sympathetic to the issues of people of color. The Communist Party integrated their ranks as early as 1930 to include blacks in national leadership positions, subsequently participating with the NAACP when they were not promoted within other parties. It also must be noted that the NAACP and communists had very close ties, at least until the early 50s during the Red Scare, when the NAACP distanced itself from the communist factions within its organization.
Let's not call anyone a communist just because he happens to disagree with us. And be doubly alert when the communists start hunting you.
As mentioned in a previous episode, the NAACP and communists collaborated on the defense of the Scottsboro Boys case in 1935. Du Bois attended the University of Berlin, the literal home of communist philosophy. Graduates of the University of Berlin include George Friedrich Hegel, the father of Hegelianism, socialist Friedrich Engels, and of course Karl Marx, the father of communism. This would further mold his communist philosophies. In contrast, while Garvey was not openly a communist, he did entertain cooperation with communists under certain circumstances. His newspaper, Negro World, was initially published by a Socialist Party press, with known socialist Wilfred Domingo as its first editor. Although Garvey admired the organizational skills of socialists and communists, his views leaned more towards conservatism, especially with his Back to Africa movement, which found an ironic and surprising echo among Southern white supremacists and the Ku Klux Klan.
I don't have to apologize to anybody for being black because God Almighty knew exactly what he was doing when he made me black.
His Back to Africa movement ingratiated him into the ranks of the Southern white supremacists. Garvey and the Klan found common ground on the adage that all American blacks, especially in the South, should move back to Africa.
There's certain parts of Africa in which you cannot live at all. So it is for you to come together and give us a United States of Africa. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And that America was a white man's country. This separatist philosophy was antithetical to that of Du Bois, whose platform was more centered around integration. Although both of these men had opposing platforms, there seemed to be some level of respect between them, at least from the position of Garvey. In his correspondence through letters to Du Bois, he was always respectful and complimentary of Little Willie. And although their social ideas didn't align, they both found common ground with Pan-Africanism, both representing two of the most notable organizations of the time, the NAACP and the United Negro Improvement Association. Both schools of thought, coupled with the secret invasion of the hidden hand, would influence future movements of Black people in the decades to come.
If Black people knew their glorious past, then they would be more inclined to respect themselves. Yes, you heard of Johnny Walker Red and Black. Well, he had his adversities, but he's still going strong.
America were not particularly enthusiastic. For instance, the NAACP supported the first two Pan-African Congresses, but not the others, because, as some of the trustees said, we've got enough problems here in the United States without going to Africa to look up others. So that there wasn't much American Negro support for the Pan-African movement.
The reason why Garvey and Du Bois are so important is because each of their philosophies represents the dichotomy of Black intellectual thought: liberalism and integration, conservatism and separation. The ironic thing about all this is the fact that the Democratic Party was the conservative right-leaning party at the time. So when Garvey met with the Ku Klux Klan, they were Democrats. This is in contrast to the party's political philosophy today. The Democrats are now known for integration. Yet, as we have already mentioned before, several Black Republican congressmen had already been elected in the South during the Reconstruction era. And it was this Democratic-associated Ku Klux Klan who violently opposed integration and Black participation in political forms of Southern government. It was Andrew Jackson who founded the Democratic Party and removed and enslaved Indians in the South. Again, the South had only been conquered for less than 50 years before emancipation. At this point, there is a political game at play, and the growing numbers of new voting and politically active so-called Blacks meant the powers that be needed to create a new Black delegation. And the philosophy born out of the new Harlem Negro was the catalyst for the next generation's delegations.
Black delegation request Eminem.
Wait a goddamn minute, Rondell. That's not part of the party.
Hustler, baby.
All right, well, no hustling me.
Hustler, baby. All right, well, no hustling me.
There are so many key players in Harlem at this time, it's impossible to cover them all in one episode. Harlem was the place where every fancy Showtime Negro wanted to live. The penthouses of the upper Negrostocracy were some of the most plush in the city. These were the first generations of Front Street fancy coons on display for the masses of American pop culture. By the 1930s, white people were starting to become fans of some pretty special Negroes. And these Negroes would have never been embraced by whites in the years before. Poets, singers, dancers, even authors, essentially entertainment was the black person's getaway into the Harlem spotlight. During this time, literature was the top propaganda of the day, and reading was considered entertainment. Beginning in the 1900s, Harlem saw a dramatic influx of West Indian immigrants, but most notably Southern blacks migrating from the South during the earliest times of the Great Migration. The early days of the Harlem hype were a best-kept secret from white America, but after the promotion of the Harlem Renaissance, the mainstream public became aware of all of the happenings uptown, and they were quite interested. Carl von Victen's book, Nigger Heaven, was possibly the most popular source in promoting the Harlem Renaissance to white America. His book was a national bestseller. A white man from a wealthy family from Iowa was seen as a controversial figure in the history of the Harlem Renaissance. On one hand, he promoted the movement to the mainstream public, but the title of his book offended many people, including his friends. Not only this, but von Victen is seen as being a little too comfortable at the cookout. His cookout shenanigans got under many a Negro skin. His friends were the leading patrons of the Renaissance. Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, Wallace Thurman. However, his homoerotic characterization of black men and sexualization of black culture in general seem to rub niggas the wrong way.
Brother, what's that?
And he was often criticized for his lascivious depictions of black culture.
What's that, brother?
An openly gay man who also kept a wife vexed many black individuals of the time who found it problematic to see him dating black women and flaunting them flamboyantly throughout the streets of Harlem, especially after being associated with cross-dressing male prostitutes, especially during a time when segregation persisted in places like the Cotton Club, where black musicians could perform but black patrons could not attend. Von Victen found it humorous, emboldening, even satisfying to take black women for experiences they could not have with black men. The women often found in his company were perceived by black men as being brazen, shameless Jezebels, perfectly intent to do as they will in the name of women's rights, philandering through the city with flamboyant white men who, by funding some of the most popular black women in the community, these gay men were becoming the influential force within this new Negro movement. The title, The New Negro Movement, as coined by Alain Locke, is the predecessor title to the Harlem Renaissance, which, according to Hubert Harrison, was a name created by white people. Alain Locke is considered the sweet father of the later coined Harlem Renaissance. He wrote the anthology entitled The New Negro, and it went platinum in the streets. Alain Locke was from the upper crust of aristocratic Philadelphia Negroes with cream and cheese. He was Phi Beta Kappa, a Rhodes Scholar, went to Harvard and the University of Berlin, and he pledged Phi Beta Sigma? All right. Hey, do you think the Depression era Negroes got hazed when they were pledging in a fraternity? Like, for example, did Alain Locke have to fry bacon and scramble eggs butt naked for his Lion brothers during the pledge? And if so, did he like it? Because Alain Locke himself had a long history of burgling turkey.
to this day, when people study the Harlem Renaissance, they often don't consider the LGBTQ aspects of it. And part of that is because many of the gay writers did not actually identify as gay.
Quote, "The gay trailblazer of the Harlem Renaissance," biographer Jeffrey C. Stewart on Alain Locke. LambdaLiteraryReview.org. Dr. Jeffrey Stewart is a Alain Locke and Harlem Renaissance historian. Quote, "The talented 10th, as I mentioned, was Du Bois' concept, really a breakthrough in American intellectual history, as it created a rationale for the contribution of intellectuals to public life beyond simply their love of ideas or employment of their intellect in their professions. It was a progressive notion that those of the Black group who achieved academic distinction had an obligation to do something for those left behind, the 9-10s, not only to uplift them, but also fight the discourse of public racism that suffused the sciences, religion, public life generally. Locke took that concept and turned it into something new, that the real talented 10th was the cadre of Black artists who, until him, were not foregrounded in discussions of Black politics, and made these artists the vanguard of change. That's because Locke believed that it was in the realm of imagination and literature, visual art, theater, film, and music that a new idea of the Negro, the new Negro, and of America, a new America, could emerge. Dueling factions within the Negrostocracy, where Du Bois' concept was a little more politically based, Alain Locke's was art-based, literature-based, theater-based, music-based. So Locke can be credited with being the first member of the intellectual talented 10th to argue and define a role for the artists as members of the talented 10th, whose art could make a difference for the masses of Black people.
He felt hounded by the typical puritanical homophobia that is characteristic of the United States. He could never really be openly engaged with someone. He had a kind of furtive life, even when he was at Howard University. And so he would go abroad every summer, and he could live more freely in places, Paris, Berlin.
Continuing, quote, "I think Locke was relatively unique among the 1920s Black arts community for never questioning his homosexuality or masquerading as heterosexual, as, for example, Countee Cullen, his young friend, did by marrying Yolanda Du Bois. So Countee Cullen was gay, and he was married to W.E.B. Du Bois' daughter, who was encouraged by her father to marry Countee Cullen. They later got a divorce, but this is just an example of the type of Negro sexual tomfuckery we're dealing with in early Harlem. At the same time, he was paralyzingly discreet, as he once described himself, someone who was so concerned about his sexuality being revealed that he, for example, as one of his friends noted, constantly changed the name above his doorbell at his home so that visitors did not know that was his address. He was so worried about people finding out he was gay, he changed the name above his door because he was probably knocking off street urchins at 3 a.m. That's just speculation. I don't know that he was doing that, but possibly. Continuing, I also think it has a deeper impact. Sexuality was really what he was most interested in. Sexuality is what Alain Locke was most interested in. Yet he could not write about it for publication during his era. In some respects, not being able to write about what really mattered to him stunted his ability to be a creative writer, something he longed to be but never quite achieved. He launched his career as a critic instead of a creative writer, as kind of his compromise, if you will, with the reality that he could never out himself in print, even as he lived in an open closet as a man. I mean, the closet wasn't completely open, because if it was, he would have just kept his name on the door.
The consequences of not teaching the period of the Harlem Renaissance as being inherently queer is that queerness remains white in the cultural imaginary because we don't have this story of Black queerness.
Quote, I think that being gay made Locke look distant and skeptical of the logic of Black protest that was the dominant form of Black aesthetics in the late 1910s and early 1920s. Protest literature was largely the bailiwick of the NAACP and such writers as Du Bois, Angela Grimke, and others. I think that Locke felt constantly focusing on race and white racism that left unexamined those aspects of Black life that did not fit into the protest frame. Uh-oh, you see where we're going? We're about to get there. So we can see that he almost is looking to try to combine the movement into the combined experience, it seems. I also believe he felt that protest and NAACP cultural politics were heteronormative and marginalized stories that did not fit the NAACP strategy to craft Black stories that affirmed that Blacks were as middle class as other Americans. Being openly gay opened Locke to modernism because it was in modernism that voices like his could be heard. I also think Locke's sexuality made him suspicious of certain forms of Black nationalism that excluded anyone who did not fit a romantic notion of triumphant Black manhood. Locke looked at them suspiciously. They were sus to him, apparently, according to Dr. Jeffrey Stewart. Locke sought a roomier notion of Black identity, that could allow the queer and the unfixed notions of sexual identity to lurk, if not flourish. Uh-oh. I think Alain Locke would be real happy right now. He would be glowing. Alain Locke would be glowing to see Black Lives Matter and forms of protest today, where we've seen that they have all but tried to amalgamate the gay identity into the Black identity. Locke did not want Black America to create an alternate to white America that was as repressive and Puritan as the mainstream. They're gay and they're also Black.
Where a lot of the Black and brown queer people were the ones who were at the forefront of this movement. And so it's important to uncover this history to, again, recover these ancestors. Who really led the charge and try to unforget all the liberation that they created.
NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project. Oh, Mount Morris Baths. Okay. Between the 1920s and 2003, when it was closed by New York City officials, the Mount Morris Baths was an important social center for gay African-American men and one of the longest operating bathhouses in New York City. Until the 1960s, it was the only openly gay bathhouse in the city to admit African-American men due to overt discrimination. Yes, bathhouses are gay, apparently exclusively gay. And it's crazy, it says Turkish baths, Mount Morris, men only. Located in the basement of the Lauren Grin apartment house, the Mount Morris Baths, originally the Mayor Baths, was the first commercial tenant of this space. The establishment, featuring Turkish and Russian baths, catered to a mostly Jewish clientele, and in the late 19th century was known as a hangout for police officers. Okay. Jews, cops, and gays. By 1915, the baths were renamed the Mount Morris Baths, and by the 1920s and 30s, African American patrons began frequenting the baths, reflecting the changes in demographics of the neighborhood. Uh-oh, here come the niggas. And they want to bathe with men too. When exactly it began to attract a predominantly gay African American clientele is unknown. But it was most likely during the 1920s, during the Harlem Renaissance. In 1923, Carl Van Vechten, patron of the Harlem Renaissance, noted in his diary that he had visited the baths. Now, why doesn't that surprise me? Obviously, right? I mean, come on. It was probably, that doesn't surprise me, which at the time was known for its rough trade. What does that mean? I don't want to know. Actually, I do not want to know what that means. In 1930, County Cullen left his wife, Yolanda Du Bois, for Harold Jackman, who he had allegedly met at the baths. A good old bathhouse. Lincoln Kirstein characterized the baths as a rendezvous for notorious homosexuals, deviated perverts, and merchant seamen. Merchant seamen. Oh, like maybe some Abyssinian merchant seamen. Never mind. That's you wouldn't get that joke just yet. Reportedly, straight African-American celebrities frequented the baths in the 1950s, including Sam Cooke and Joe Louis. I mean, how? But apparently, Sam Cooke and Joe Louis were good. They didn't do anything gay in the bathhouse. It was also noted that James Baldwin once brought Marlon Brando to the baths. Okay. James Baldwin and Marlon Brando. See, I'm telling you. In the 1970s and 80s, singer Jermaine Stewart, actor Gene Anthony Ray, and legendary superstar Sylvester were patrons. Most likely in the 1970s, a large rectangular illuminated plastic sign was installed at street level that read, Mount Morris Turkish Baths, Men Only, establishing a presumably overt gay presence in Harlem. Men only. Establishing a presumably overt gay presence in Harlem. In October 1985, seeking to slow the spread of AIDS, New York State took the controversial position of empowering the New York City Department of Health to close bathhouses and other places where high-risk sexual activities were reported, which took place in November and December of that year. Several other bathhouses were closed by their owners in 1986 due to a decline in patronage. The Mount Morris baths were one of the few that remained open by discouraging public sex and educating clientele about AIDS. So we know what was going on in the bathhouse. It served as an important social service known for its emphasis on sex education during a period when there were few AIDS, HIV reach-out programs for gay men of color and men who did not want to identify as gay but had sex with men. For gay men of color and men who did not identify as gay but had sex with men. In 2003, city officials closed the facility due to alleged structural problems. End quote. Entry by Ken Lustbader. Ken Lustbader. That's an appropriate name. End quote. New York, LGBT something or another. End quote.
But I also think that being abroad was a source of renewal and inspiration. It was almost like Europe and then later on Egypt were his muse. And through that process, he got ideas. For example, one of the things I discovered in working on this, that his first draft of the New Negro essay was written in San Remo, Italy, which is kind of odd that you would go abroad, but that gave him a vantage point.
Continuing, in many respects, Langston Hughes was the unrequited love of Locke's life. Yes, that Langston Hughes. And his pursuit of a love affair with Hughes both energized and destroyed his efforts to support Hughes as a writer. Langston Hughes had Alain Locke's nose wide open. Locke spent time with Hughes in Europe romanticizing him, only to be abandoned by Hughes after a moment of intimacy. Damn, he fucked and ducked on him. He poked and smoked. He achieved and leaved. Hughes penetrated and evaporated. And this had Locke fucked up in his mind. He was on that ragtime crash out, only to be abandoned by Hughes after a moment of intimacy. Oh, you know that fucked him up. You know that fucked him up. He's like, what's wrong with me? Now he's questioning if his butt's any good. Got banged by old Lang. Then Lang sprang, and Alan sang the blues. But this had an important effect, for I believe that the love of Hughes opened Locke's eyes to what Hughes loved. And no, I'm not talking about new So that love catalyzed an awakening in Locke and allowed him to identify with Black people more than he ever had. Oh man, that's good. End quote. LambdaLiteraryReview.org. Alain Locke, out here in the streets crashing out over Langston Hughes.
There was also, of course, the drag ball scene in Harlem, which not everyone talks about. That goes all the way back to the 20s in Harlem. And so it was quite a free time. And ironically, that freedom of sexual expression as well as gender fluidity really petered out. The Great Depression is said to have caused the downfall of the Harlem Renaissance, as well as the increasing conservatism in American culture after the Second World War.
This new movement was beginning to lose steam, and the Great Depression did not help that cause. Over the course of time, people started to criticize the movement due to its promotion of decadence and sexuality. And a leading voice of opposition to all of this decadence and homosexuality was none other than the strong, Black voice of Adam Clayton Powell Sr. Adam Clayton Powell Sr. was the minister of the historic Abyssinian Baptist Church. The Abyssinian Baptist Church can trace its history to the early 1800s. Thomas Paul, the Freemason, prominent Boston Negro who founded the first African Baptist Church, is also said to be a founder of the Abyssinian Baptist Church. According to the legend, seamen from Abyssinia, aka modern Ethiopia, attended some other predominantly white church and were made to sit in the balcony, aka nigger heaven. So in protest, they supposedly walked out and started their own congregation. You'll notice this is a recurring theme in the history of several other Black firsts in American history. Similar to the story of Richard Allen and Absalom Jones being at segregated St. George's Methodist Church, a white Philadelphia church, they were not treated with the same equality as whites. This prompted them to start the African Methodist Episcopal Church. This is also similar to the story of Prince Hall being excluded from Freemasonry and deciding to start a Masonic society for so-called Blacks. The Abyssinian Baptist Church was located in a few places in the city, most recently Greenwich Village in a place dubbed Little Africa, before moving and finding its new home in Harlem, right on time for the new Negro Movement. Adam Clayton Powell Sr. was the minister of the church during the hottest times in Harlem and had grown the congregation to over 10,000 people, making it one of the largest Baptist congregations in the world. This made Powell perhaps the most influential Black man in all of America. But was he really even Black though? Despite his light complexion and blue eyes, several supposedly trusted publications regard Powell as an African American. But his ancestry and genealogical records show no African or so-called Black ancestors. Born in Virginia, the Black ancestry he supposedly has is really Indian from his mother's side. She was listed on the 1860 census as a free person of color. A man with traceable white and Indian blood identifies himself as African. This would also be a common theme throughout the course of this movement. According to Powell, he never knew his father. Another common theme. All of these antebellum, early 20th century American heroes never know their father, and their father is the supposed missing deadbeat dad. And the deadbeat dad is always a white dad, especially white planters. Some of these men were so despicable they would enslave their own children for $1 and then sell their own children for $2 or maybe even 50 cents. According to Powell, he never knew his father. However, local rumors in Halesford, Virginia say that he is most likely a descendant of Lewin Powell, a white planter of the same surname who lived near the area his mother was from. During his later days in Harlem, it is said that Powell identified as black, but he had long been passing for white in the South before moving north. It was in the North his popularity rose to celebrated proportions. And it was in the North where he would assert his black identity. But for as much as he was celebrated in Harlem, it was his son who stole the show. Powell Sr. preached at the Abyssinian Baptist Church for over 30 years before retiring. When he retired, he handed over the reins to his son, Adam. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. would become a Harlem hero and one of the key figures within the early Black Power movement, the new face of the Democratic Party, and the perpetual cookout invitee. Speculation about the Clayton Powell bloodline has always been at the forefront of the conversation throughout the life of Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Blessed with the holy gift of gab, he had an almost Jim Jones influence over the local Harlem community. The white-looking man who preached and talked like a black man with the nerve to spit that hot, greasy fire at the white power establishment. He possessed the ultimate light-skinned license to talk reckless, to the point that many of the most militant black leaders of the time saw him as the strongest voice in the black community.
I'm just in
People in New York send Powell to Washington, D.C. As long as Powell speaks like a black man. And the day that Powell ceases to speak like a black man, you'll find that black people in New York will cease to send black people in New York will cease to send Powell to Washington. So I give you that answer. I'm not saying that Powell is right or Powell is wrong. That's not the question. But Powell does represent black people to the degree that black people support him. But most of these other Negro leaders that you see running around here are nothing but Uncle Toms outright who have no independent voice of their own, and you never hear them open up their mouth until the white man gives them the right to open up their mouth. And then when they open up their mouth, they always take great care not to alienate what they consider to be the white liberal.
Quote, "The racial identity of Adam Clayton Powell Jr., a case study in racial ambivalence and redefinition." Quote, "Adam Clayton Powell Jr., one of America's most militant 20th century black leaders, was also one of its most paradoxical. This son of Harlem, who called himself a marching black and the first bad nigger in Congress, was to all appearances a white man. His fair complexion, hazel eyes, aquiline nose, and straight hair belied his black identity. In a nation consumed by racial distinctions, Powell's apparently racial ambiguity influenced his life in significant ways. As a young man, it caused him to pass for white and later to create a false racial ancestry that would legitimize his black identity.
And later create a false racial ancestry that would legitimize his black identity."
Ultimately, it made him more militant as a black leader and enabled him to redefine what it meant to be black. Powell developed his reputation for aggressive, outspoken leadership as a young man in the midst of the Great Depression of the 1930s. He led protests that secured thousands of jobs for African Americans in New York City. In 1941, he became the first African American elected to New York City Council. 4 years later, he was the first African American to enter the U.S. Congress from New York City. The first from New York City. Not the first, but the first from New York City. Until the emergence of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and the appearance of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the national stage, Powell kept the African American struggle for equal rights alive. In the 1960s, Powell reached the pinnacle of his political influence as a chairman of the House Education and Labor Committee. Although his legislative power was eclipsed when he was stripped of his chairmanship and excluded from membership in the 90th Congress in 1967, a matter which is dealt with elsewhere, he retained his influence among African Americans. It is significant that during his legal battles, civil rights leaders Martin Luther King, A. Philip Randolph, Roy Wilkins, and Whitney Young came to his defense. In the African American civil rights struggle, Powell was supremely self-confident, at times even arrogant. He acquired a national reputation as a fearless fighter who would not tolerate racial bigotry directed at him personally or at his people. He never hesitated to speak his mind. Whether it was in denouncing New York's Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia as a fascist or in attacking Mississippi's Congressman Theodore Bilbo as a racist. Nevertheless, when Powell's own racial identity was at issue, he could be insecure and uncertain. Throughout his life, he was defensive about his fair skin and self-conscious about his race. As Chuck Stone, his press representative, said, Powell was always sensitive about a white skin that housed a black militancy. There were good reasons for his sensitivity. Despite Powell's widespread acceptance in the black community, there were blacks and whites who viewed him suspiciously. Once at a city hall hearing, a black man accused Powell of fraudulently calling himself a Negro. Powell's childhood friend said that his fair complexion resulted in Negroes who complained that he is a stranger in our midst. Writer Frank Hercules, who admired Powell, confessed that he considered Powell to be essentially a white man calling himself black. He was black merely by courtesy, Hercules asserted. But it was a white journalist, Richard Levine, who in analyzing Powell's ancestry concluded that his blackness was more a matter of choice than identity. He wasn't really a black man. He was a black man by choice. He was trans black. Such attitudes made skin color a central dilemma of Powell's life, but one that ultimately strengthened him and enabled him to better understand the meaning of race in America. The origin of Powell's insecurity can be traced to a childhood that did not emphasize race. He was born in 1908, the same year his father left New Haven's Emmanuel Baptist Church to pastor the Abyssinian Baptist Church, founded a century earlier. Adam Clayton Powell Sr. was a self-made man, born into a desperately poor family in Virginia in 1865. He worked his way through Wayland Seminary, a Baptist institution in Washington, D.C., and became a charismatic leader, dynamic orator, and adroit administrator. Powell was responsible for moving Abyssinian into an imposing new office on 138th Street in Harlem in 1923 and developing it into the largest Black congregation in the United States with over 10,000 members. Adam was raised as a rich, indulged child, adored by his father and the three women in his home, his mother Maddie, his nurse Josephine, and his sister Blanche, 10 years his senior. Old-timers remember young Adam as a pretty curly-haired child, coddled and pampered by his parents and every sister and saint in the church, said writer Claude Lewis. Residing in a palatial townhouse that his father had purchased when whites were fleeing Harlem, Adam was prohibited from engaging in rough and tumble street life. Although he attended public school in the neighborhood, his parents ensured that his friends came from well-to-do circumstances. Years later, when Adam started working in Harlem, he had to confront the uncomfortable fact that he knew very little about how the other half lived. Up until then, he had resided in, but had not truly understood Harlem.
Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was born in New Haven, Connecticut in 1908. He was a pampered, privileged child. His mother dressed him in Little Lord Fauntleroy suits. He had blonde hair and hazel eyes. His father, Adam Clayton Powell Sr., was the pastor of New York City's Abyssinian Baptist Church. By 1923, he had built it into the largest Protestant congregation in America and housed it in a magnificent new structure.
Continuing, Powell's father and mother were fair-skinned as Adam, but had always identified as Black. Powell Sr. was an advocate of racial pride, who stated that he never desired to be anything other than a Negro. He just continued to ride in the white-only section of the train in the South. Isabel Washington said that God made the most beautiful flower garden in the world when he made the colored race. He made them from alabaster white to ebony black and all colors in between. Yet when Adam appealed to him for help in understanding his race, he was ignored. All his father would say was that he was mixed, which only added to Adam's confusion. At home, Adam said there was never any consciousness of race. Hey, Dad, I have some questions about my race. Son, you're mixed, all right? What's all this race talk? You're mixed. While Powell Sr. publicly promoted racial acceptance and uplift, privately he gave a wide berth to any mention of race. He feared that it might adversely influence his son and cause him to experience feelings of inferiority and worthlessness. According to psychologists, however, this was a poor strategy. Psychologist Kurt Lewin asserted that avoiding racial problems rather than producing a self-confident child most often results in its opposite. If a child grows up in an unreal world believing that there is no prejudice, their security will be shattered when they encounter it. The group a child belongs to must be valued because it provides a foundation of stability. Kenneth B. Clark demonstrated that Black children as young as 3 who are not taught racial pride will often reject their color and show a preference for white skin. Adam's upbringing, therefore, could have contributed to his early confusion about race. Powell Sr. may have avoided discussing racial issues because he was beset by his own ambivalence. Despite the difference in his appearance from most Harlemites with his white skin, blue eyes, and light brown hair, he occupied prestigious positions as a leading Black representative of his community. He sat on the boards of the NAACP and the Urban League and was appointed to commissions on Harlem by Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia. Members of Abyssinian looked on his fair skin favorably at times and would compare him in appearance to Jesus Christ. Kenneth B. Clark, who grew up in Harlem, recalls, "When as a child I first saw him, I thought he was God." So we can see that the white light skin is actually working in his favor. When these niggas in Harlem see him, they think he's Jesus. They think he's God. Who is this white man? Yet, despite his social acceptance from the Black community, there were limits to Powell Sr.'s racial pride. In fact, he was known not to reveal his racial origins when it was convenient, although he claimed never at any time wanting to be a white man and of never trying to pass for anything but who I am. He willingly rode in white-only Pullman cars when traveling in the South. Bright and quick-witted, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was an excellent student until adolescence when he discovered girls and began spending an inordinate amount of time socializing. As a result, he was forced to spend an additional semester in high school in order to graduate. Even so, he graduated at the age of 16 and with considerable parental pressure enrolled at the City College of New York. By the end of the first semester, however, carousing caused him to fail 3 subjects. Only his father's personal acquaintance with the college president kept him from being expelled. So he's already using a little bit of his light privilege. In the following semester, he failed 5 of 6 subjects and was expelled. Adam's academic failure resulted from his rebellion against his father's puritanical strictures against card playing, movies, and drinking, and his own inherent propensity for enjoying life's sensual pleasures. Oh, propensity for life's sensual pleasures. young Adam was getting it in. He was running the streets, playing cards, drinking, going to movies. In this, he was following the example of his married sister Blanche, 10 years his senior. She encouraged his rebelliousness by teaching him the latest dances, accompanying him to parties, and on double dates. Her sudden death during his second semester culminated in his complete withdrawal from college work. So Big Sis put him on in the streets. Adam's exposure from CCNY precipitated a family crisis. Considering him out of control, his mother tried to reform her wayward son by forcing him to get down on his knees and pray with her for deliverance from his wantonness. Fortunately, an old family friend diagnosed Adam as suffering from normal adolescent rebelliousness, and he recommended that Adam be sent away from home to Colgate University, an all-male institution with a reputation for academic rigor and manly discipline. The choice of Colgate was fortuitous since the president of the college, Dr. George Barton Cutton, was an old acquaintance of Powell Sr. from his New Haven days. Here we go again. He withdrew from City College of New York, was almost about to get expelled. Powell Sr., his daddy come in, save his ass. He still ends up dropping out after his sister dies. And then they try to rehabilitate his wantonness and send him to Colgate, where Dr. George Cutton was an old friend of his father from his New Haven days. More light privilege, maybe it's just who you know, has nothing to do with skin color. This personal connection got Adam admitted despite his dismal academic record. When Adam arrived at Colgate in September 1926 at the age of 17, he could not have known that over the next 4 years, his racial identity would be permanently transformed, paving the way for his success as a minister and political leader. The Colgate student body consisted of almost 1,000 men, all of whom were white, with the exception of Adam and 4 other black students who were recruited as athletes: senior Merton Anderson, sophomore Ray Vaughn, and freshman Daniel Cosby and John Enoch. The lopsided racial ratio was typical of white institutions of the era. What was exceptional was that the college violated its own tradition of segregating the races in the dormitories by placing Adam with a white roommate, Howard Patterson, who was also from New York City. Blacks were always assigned with other black roommates, or they roomed alone. President Cutton, by treating Adam as a white student, even though his father identified as black, gave Adam the option to assume a white identity. Adam proceeded to take advantage of the situation and made the crucial decision to pass for white.
"The boys didn't know I was a Negro, and I didn't bother to tell them,"
he later confessed. Things did not work out as Adam had expected. Although it was months before black football star player Ray Vaughn discovered that there might be another black student on campus, Adam, who loved sports, had avoided speaking to the black athletes, including Vaughn, even though he and Vaughn were in the same German language class. One black student who was acquainted with Powell during this period was Conrad Lynn from nearby Syracuse University.
Adam really liked me. I was just offended by Adam because he was not so good to some of his friends and who I knew at Syracuse. And so it hurt me, and I withdrew. But I know that Adam was a great influence because later on he did such great work in Congress.
Lynn, who came from Long Island, occasionally accompanied Adam on the New York Central train ride upstate on weekends. He reported that Powell spoke openly about his passing for white and used to laugh and joke about how it facilitated his clandestine interracial dating. Oh, he was getting white and black cheeks. In fact, as soon as Adam arrived at Colgate, he began dating the daughter of a local white Baptist minister. Okay, he was playing both sides of that fence. Adam had no intention of reforming his party boy lifestyle and spent as little time as possible on his studies. He got along famously with his white roommate, with whom he drove to nearby towns in search of liquor and girls. That's some college boy shit right there. Things were going so well that he applied for membership in an all-white fraternity. Things were going so well that he applied for membership in an all-white fraternity on campus, which turned out to be his undoing. As his future friend Ray Vaughn explained, they checked into his family background the way they do when you are pledged and found out he was passing. When the news traveled around the small campus community, nobody, white or Negro, would speak to him. What most disturbed Adam was that Patterson, his best friend, went to the dean saying he couldn't live with a Negro and asked to be moved to another room. So he used to go chase girls with old buddy. Now he's like, you know what, I can't. There's a nigga in the room and let me out. Deeply wounded and finding himself rooming alone, he said that it was the first time in his life that deep discrimination had touched him directly. But what was really the discrimination though? Were they discriminating against him because of his race, or was it because he lied? But did he really even lie though? Because outing himself as a Negro meant that he'd actually have to be a Negro. However, it was the black, not the white students, who were most unsettled by Adam's actions. Among the white students, Patterson was the exception. Notwithstanding, Adam's rejection from the fraternity made white students look at his passing in stride, and he maintained numerous white friendships over the course of his 4 years at the college. Howard Armstrong became his closest white friend during that first year, and remained so thereafter. They drove together all over central New York, from Utica to Ithaca in Armstrong's car, and Powell invited Armstrong to his home, where he introduced him to the Abyssinian, the Cotton Club, and Harlem nightlife. See, they could get into the Cotton Club. Just, if you actually looked black, you couldn't get in. But Adam Clayton Powell could get in. Him and his white friend used to drive all over New York. The 4 black students were another matter. They were furious with Adam. His behavior had touched their core beliefs concerning racial integrity and left them feeling insulted and rejected. Adam was now faced with a choice. Was he going to try to ingratiate himself with the majority whites on campus, or was he going to acknowledge his black identity and draw closer to the small circle of black students? Powell tried to pass because he arrived at Colgate with unresolved identity conflicts. He felt that he occupied a marginal status on the boundary between white and black. It's some kind of a joke, Adam said about his white skin. White folks think I'm black and black folks think I'm white. Uncertain of the racial ground he stood on made him vulnerable to self-rejection and to crossing over the slender line separating the races.
Whether you like our leaders or not, we got them. We got our Stokely Carmichaels. Yes. We got our Rap Brown. We had our Malcolm X. We got our Floyd McKissick. And you got the old man of the sea.
Continuing, Adam's diary over the next 3 college years charted his growth in maturity, self-confidence, and identity. During his first year and part of his second, Adam was enrolled in a rigorous pre-medical curriculum, but showed little interest in his studies, doing only did the bare minimum to get by. Then at the intervention of his father, Adam took another decisive step. One weekend when Vaughn was visiting the Powell home, Powell Sr. asked Vaughn to persuade Adam to switch his major from pre-med to religion and consider becoming a preacher. That night, as they drove back to Colgate, Vaughn spoke to Adam about the advantages of going into the church and explaining that it was all set up for him to inherit his father's position. Adam, who had always known his father wanted him to follow in his footsteps, required little convincing. For he soon changed his major and started preparing for the ministry. His grades improved, going from C's to B's in his junior year and to A's his senior year. Years later, looking back with satisfaction at fulfilling his father's wishes, he stated, "I take particular pride in the fact that I have carried out my father's hope for his church." As he wrote in one of his books, "I built this church, but my son will interpret it. This I have done." Adam's new formed association with the Black church, especially a historic one like Abyssinian, drew him that much closer to the cultural heritage of African Americans, thereby strengthening his Black identity. I'm a black man now. He's black now. While still in college, he began preaching at Abyssinian. And before he graduated, his growing reputation as an orator led to his being invited to preach at other large Harlem churches, including St. Paul, Mount Olivet, and Salem. As he contemplated his future as a black minister in Harlem, he wrote in his diary during his junior year, "I wonder how it will all turn out. Whatever the final outcome," he stated, "all I want to do is keep the faith and serve my people." When Powell left Colgate with a bachelor's degree in 1930 at the beginning of the Great Depression, the development of his black identity shifted from college to the church and the streets. He was more confident of his identity now than when he had entered Colgate 4 years previously. Nevertheless, it was not certain what kind of black man he would be, or how he would cope with the problem of his fair complexion. After a summer tour of Europe that his father gave him as a graduation present, the 22-year-old, hold on, for graduation, we're gonna send you on a tour of Europe. That's definitely some white shit. The 22-year-old began working as director of Abyssinian Charities. It was a challenging job for someone whose privileged upbringing had kept him from gaining any real knowledge of the hard scrabble of ordinary black folks. He admitted that at the time he had no feeling or sensitivity for the suffering around him. Adam's charity work broadened his understanding of the black community and caused him to emphasize more deeply with the people on the bottom of the social ladder. It was the maids, janitors, and laborers who struggled to put food on the table and pay Harlem's exorbitant rents who earned his sympathy. In due course, he publicly identified himself with the ordinary working class field Negroes, in contrast to the upper echelon fair-skinned class to which he was raised, whom he denigrated as house Negroes. It is the masses of folks in whom he had implicit faith, he said. It was the people in high places whom he distrusted. His proletarian sympathies, however, formed a marked contrast with his love of luxury and high living. He might have identified with the masses, but he lived in an affluent Westchester County suburb, lunched at the exclusive 21 Club, and vacationed at his summer home on Martha's Vineyard. It was a contradiction he never resolved.
Black power? Black power, my friends.
What differentiated Adam from most black political leaders was his greater militancy and outspokenness. It was a militancy that was motivated by the uniqueness of his fair complexion. He had that light-skinned license to talk reckless. Compensating for his unusual appearance and his anxiety about his identity, Adam became more politically aggressive than blacks of the darkest complexions. He idolized the ebony-colored black nationalist Marcus Garvey, not the NAACP's ivory-colored Walter White. Adam may have been afraid that if he was less militant than other black leaders, people would attribute it to the color of his skin, thinking that he was associating himself with the elitism of the lighter-skinned black upper classes. Consequently, the harder and more militantly he fought, the less likely it would be that his black identity would be challenged. End quote.
But I'm right. He'll fight my battle, and I'll be free someday. Therefore, stand together, children. Work together, children. Fight together, children. Work together, children. Work together, children. Work together. Work together, children. Don't you get weary. Trade can't meet in the promised land.
What is your opinion as a politician of Adam Clayton Powell?
Well, Adam Clayton Powell probably is the only Negro politician of national stature who is completely independent of any political machine. He's in a more powerful position politically than any other Negro politician, primarily because the Negro in New York is different from Negroes anywhere else in the country, in that they are exposed to such a great deal of news. The United Nations is there. They're more highly sophisticated where politics and international politics are concerned than any other Negroes in the country.
Black power? Black power, my friends, means that we are developing now a new breed of cats. You know, when you read the Bible and you hear about old Daniel going in the lion's den, the Bible is so old, and the mythology of the Bible is not exact. When they lowered Daniel down in that lion's den, they might have been Black Panthers down there.
What was Malcolm's reason for trusting so much in Adam? On one hand, he was a flamboyant, fair-skinned man of elite privilege. On the other, he represented the working class poor of Harlem with a militant rigor. And for whatever reason, Malcolm saw him as genuine and authentically a black man, as he had referenced Adam being a great Negro leader several times. But the question must be asked, would Adam have had so much influence among the Negroes without the endorsement of Malcolm X? Malcolm himself stated that the Harlem Negro was more intelligent, sophisticated, and politically aware than any other Negro throughout the country. And this was the position taken in Harlem and other northern cities like Philadelphia.
And the day that Powell ceases to speak like a black man, you'll find that black people in New York will cease to send Powell to Washington.
But as far as Adam is concerned, he was the first so-called black elected politician ever in the state of New York. Now, if the Harlem Negro was so much more progressive and politically advanced than other Negroes throughout the country, as Malcolm says, why hadn't any other Negroes in the state of New York been elected before Adam Clayton Powell? Malcolm makes reference to the New York Negroes' access to news and international news. But was news, or has news ever been in the history of America any more than just propaganda? Is access to propaganda the cornerstone of intelligence and sophistication? What was it that made the Harlem Negro so special? Perhaps it was the music, or the literature, or the sexual freedom. Perhaps it was the freedom for so-called married men to have clandestine homosexual relationships. Again, what was so special about this Harlem Negro? Was it the fact that no one from Harlem was born in Harlem? Did the transplant mostly Southern nativity of the average Harlemite foster some type of impalpable genius? And what was that genius? Literature, music, secret homosexual relationships? Do these things not exist without Harlem? Was the art and music of the Harlem Renaissance one of the earliest forms of 20th century white-produced Negro propaganda? Did Negroes of the time have the power to produce and distribute their own music to a national audience? Did Negroes of the time have the means to publish and distribute books to an international audience? These are just some of the most imperative questions as it concerns the commercial patronage of this Harlem movement. Was the new Negro a white creation? Among the themes that permeated the new Negro philosophy were Pan-Africanism and liberation. But was the Pan-African ideology a product of racist whites? Or was liberation a disguise for integration? And through integration, was the political voting power of Negroes funneled secretly to racist whites? Remember, all of the Negroes in the South were elected to the Republican Party. But Adam Clayton Powell, the politician of the New Negro, was elected Democrat. What role does he play in the sway of indigenous American voting power from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party? As for the influence of the Freemasons, during this time, it was heavy. Adam Clayton Powell Sr. is listed in the 1915 publication of Who's Who of the Colored Race as a 32nd degree Freemason, and not one of them old raggedy Prince Halls either, as well as an Odd Fellow and a Knight of Pythias. The church he built, the Harlem-based Abyssinian Baptist Church, was initiated with a Freemasonic cornerstone laying ceremony. Adam Jr. was a Prince Hall Freemason and a member of Alpha Phi Alpha, the Syracuse chapter. And he would have been Cracker Phi Cracker at Colgate if it wasn't for those nosy ass white boys. But all of that didn't matter, because at the end of the day, he couldn't fight it. He became exactly what his father wanted him to be: the pastor of the Abyssinian Baptist Church. But his father could have never imagined that his son Adam would become the voice of the new Negro.
They had machine guns, recoilless rifles, grease guns, Lugers, 25 of them, all armed. And the chief of police met me at the airport when I arrived, and they were there, right there at the steps. He said, "You were violating the law." "Yeah, we're violating the law." He said, "We're tired of our white and black leaders, Jackie and Martin and Bobby, being killed. We're going to protect this man while he's here." And they didn't arrest one of them, because they said if you arrest one, then someone's going to die, because we are ready to kill.
On the next episode of Boulè, the black face of white power.